Okay. Welcome to the special edition interview of the Kepler 2020 Prediction Day. Maurice Fernandez has graciously opened his home to me here in beautiful Sedona. He wasn't able to make it to the live event, but did agree to be pre-recorded, and hence I am here interviewing him. Maurice, internationally known evolutionary astrologer and president of OPA, the Organization for Professional Astrology. And you've been quite active in your role there. And
thank you.
Moving forward. So, prolific author. Let me share the screen here. And, oh, I am sharing the screen. Here we go. So what's coming up personally?
So this is my website for those of you who are interested in learning more. I will be presenting at Kepler next term in end of January.
Yep.
So this is going to be an introductory course to evolutionary astrology, which has to do with understanding the soul journey in the chart. So we look forward to that. And then the book that I recently published, it's called Neptune, and Neptune in every house and sign, planets in the 12th house.
And I see it's subtitled The Timelessness of Truth, and truth isn't always something people associate with Neptune when they're first learning astrology.
But that's the thing, is that Neptune represents the illusion, but also the end of illusions.
Yes.
When everything is really dissolving to the core and the bare truth. So it's interesting that the year following 2020, 2022 is going to be a big year because both Jupiter and Neptune are going to conjunct in Pisces. That's another discussion.
Right. We'll be back in a couple of years for that.
So, all right. For 2020, we can move to the next.
Here's your website, because I'm not sure it was clear before, and then here we go.
So this is the chart for one of the important cycles of the year, the Pluto-Saturn cycle in Capricorn. And you can see on the chart there are about 5 planets, including Ceres, right on that degree. So it's really eye-catching.
And if this were a birth chart, it's one of those, wait, how do I unpack this?
You know, I had a client recently and she said, oh, my due date's January 12th. Like, oh, you're going to have a very powerful baby.
Yeah.
And that's the thing is, you know, many of us astrologers have been analyzing and looking at these transits. And the best way to learn is always to look back at history.
Yes.
And at the same time, it's never going to be the same.
Right.
So we need to be wise enough to make that synthesis between past and current context.
Yeah.
So, you know, 2020 has the Pluto-Saturn, and then Jupiter joins, and then Saturn moves into Aquarius, and then Mars turns retrograde in Aries and will square all that. So it's a hugely cardinal year. And when, you know, cardinal signs are so active, you know, Mars in Aries in its own sign, Saturn in Capricorn in its own sign, all of that, you know, creates some kind of identity crisis. And that's, you know, the bottom line here. Here's an Aries. An Aries who's going to have a Pluto square very soon. So it's usually a time where, you know, the cardinals are a lot about becoming. And it's a blank slate.
Yes.
Like we need to redirect our energy. So looking back at history, this happened on a global level.
Right.
1914, Pluto-Saturn in the cardinal sign of Cancer. And, you know, there's a slide there you can show. Next one. More. This one. You know, that's that's the identity crisis I'm talking about.
Right.
You know, Europe before that conjunction
Yes.
and Europe after
Yes.
the First World War, which completely redefined countries and politics, and you had empires falling, like the Russian monarchy, the Turkish
Ottoman,
Ottoman
yeah.
Empire falling. So then we had 1947, and that was the end of the Second World War. And you would think in Leo, it was the end of the war, so it's good. But then what happened? There was a vacuum of power,
Right.
which led to,
This.
you know, the big power
Right.
struggle. So from an evolutionary point of view, what we want to ask is not just, oh, this can happen and that can happen, but what are the intentions?
Mm-hmm.
Like, is it just meant to trigger something? And then why? What are we here to learn? And the way I look at it, Pluto Saturn has to do with a global redistribution of power. So what happens? Pluto and Saturn are both representing power, authority. And what is power? You know, the ability to influence, to make a difference.
Right.
So when Pluto Saturn are together, there's such strong ambition. Now think about Capricorn. It's actually a year in a very positive way where we will want to do a lot.
Mm-hmm.
And it's going to be a time where we want to gain that status and we want to be, you know, one of the players and have an influence. So it can actually be very motivating. But the problem is that there's such a hunger for you know, being a player that you can start using devious means.
Mm-hmm.
And you know, we see it's an election year in the United
Right.
States. I don't know if you looked at the convention of the Democrat. There's a date where it's going to be with the sun in Cancer opposing that Pluto Saturn. So, you know, everybody wants a piece of the pie, or to be the one who was going to distribute that pie,
or bake it in a different way, even.
and then you know, we know there's going to be some kind of scandal there. There's going to be some kind of people very unhappy, and
the sun bringing light to the
bringing
Pluto.
light, and then the power struggle
Right.
again. You know, the fact that if you look at the Pluto Saturn, on the one hand, it's a redistribution of power, which means we reshuffle the cards, and those who are in power can lose it.
Right.
Those who don't have it can grab it.
Right.
Now think about 1947. You know, Europe is after the war. Everything is collapsed. Everything is dismantled. But there's a vacuum. You know, we can grab it. You know, we can get it. And that can lead to the danger of what happened in Libya in, you know, recent history. And then what happened in, you know, in many countries where there's a problem with, yeah, let's look at the slides.
I just brought us back to January.
Okay. So the good thing about that Pluto Saturn is that we can get to a point where there is, you know, when we speak about Saturn, we think about restriction, and we speak about the government, and we speak about leadership. But think about Saturn, maybe in Vedic astrology, it has a deeper connection. Saturn being the Lord of Karma. And karma has to do with what? Not just a human-made issue, but also a spiritual justice.
Yes.
So let's go back to the Pluto. Good. So The Lord of Karma, what does that mean? It means that it's not just up to us, that there is actually a higher order here.
Mm-hmm.
And Saturn has to do with human governance and authority and legislation and all these things that we know about. But it also has to do with the fact that it's not just up to us, that there is a higher order that we need to align with.
Mm-hmm.
And if we, you bring that karmic force with Pluto,
Right.
the karma is associated with the right use of power. So usually people born with Pluto Saturn can be on either side. They can have that radar to identify people who are corrupt
Mm-hmm.
or any kind of corruption.
Mm-hmm.
You can also see that with Saturn in Scorpio, very suspicious, they don't trust authority and, into conspiracies and, never basically trusting what they see.
Right.
And the reason is that they've been burned. Like they know we cannot trust. They lost their innocence. And so those who are born with that Pluto Saturn, or if we go through that process, we are going to identify corruption as well. But it's also a time where there is going to be corruption. Right. The temptation is so strong because the vacuum of power is there.
It's one of those situations where you see something like, oh, corruption's going to be exposed. That's the good news. But the bad news is there is corruption to be exposed.
Not only that, not all corruption is exposed.
Right.
We live in this ideal world where the good guys win and the bad guys go to jail. Yeah. Not always the case. Right. And with the Pluto Saturn, you're going to have a little bit of both. Yeah. And what we can do, in our own lives is just pay attention to the way we behave. Mm-hmm. Because it's not just the bad politicians. Mm-hmm. It happens on all scales of expression and power and leadership. Right. And the thing is, with this Pluto Saturn, you can gain power. Like suddenly, Kenneth is going to be the president of this and that. Right. And then the temptation is, okay, I get this. Now I have freedom to do all these different things. So you are tempted. The temptation to pull the strings, to manipulate things is greater. And at the same time, it is true that the reaction is much faster. Like if people are misaligned and they misuse the power, there's a tendency for more immediate reactions. Mm-hmm. So think about the fact that Jupiter joins in. Right. Now, Jupiter is going to start with, we're going to have an eclipse on Christmas, right? 26th of December, which is conjunct Jupiter. And all this is again in Capricorn. Mm-hmm. So it's very ambitious. Right. Now, Jupiter, Pluto, I can think of two mythological, beings born with that. One of them is Gandhi. Mm-hmm. The other one is Nelson Mandela.
Fascinating.
Both with a conjunction. Mm-hmm. And what do we see? They were both freedom fighters. Yeah. They both exposed racism in particular, because Jupiter may have more of a, racial, ideological bias. Mm-hmm. So it tends to go more, not necessarily on a financial level, but more on an ideological level. Yeah. But they are, people born with Pluto, Jupiter, think of the giant and the dwarf. Mm-hmm. And yet both of them represent power. Mm-hmm. Jupiter in a very visible way. It's big, it's, expansive and whatnot. And Pluto represents power in a very subtle way. It's more emotional, it's more behind the scenes. So that's why it's so small, it enters through the keyholes, Uh-huh. but both of them represent growth. And people born with that are usually what I call them indestructible, because they survive everything. And if you cut their head, they're going to go 3 more. They are those who transform, who make every crisis an opportunity.
Yeah.
So this is what we are going to experience in Capricorn. We can expect tremendous boost, tremendous growth in our own lives, as well as, politically. But at the same time, the condition to grow will be, are you able to transform this crisis into an opportunity? Because otherwise you are going to sink.
Right.
Pluto can deflate Jupiter. So there can be a feeling that actually your big tower is collapsing. But if you are resourceful, and if you are tuning into this energy, the purpose is to actually just think about Gandhi and Nelson Mandela. They were like years in jail and facing, the worst. And one faced the British Empire, the other one faced the apartheid regime in South Africa. So they prevailed.
Seemingly insurmountable opponents, and yet in time
they prevailed. And they rose to, the maximum expression of power. So, as we're looking at this year, and it is daunting because there's so much going on, and we are at the risk of redrawing maps and having, systems collapse. And I think many astrologers are talking about that. But I want to also show that it's not destruction for the sake of pain,
right,
for the sake of crisis for crisis.
Right.
It's not, Pluto can be the adrenaline junkie. Like, let's find some crisis. let's make some noise. Let's destroy some things. And it's not just that. So I can see this year as being an amazing opportunity, because in Capricorn, you are, rising your own ladder, whatever, you are aiming at. So the next phase is the second half of 2020, which we have the Mars retrograde. Next slide, I believe. Yeah. So Mars retrogrades in Aries, and it's going to square Jupiter, Pluto, Saturn. So the retrograde starts on September 9, ends around 2 months later, November 13.
Right after the election.
Yeah.
The whole election season, hotbed.
And Mars is rarely retrograde in Aries. The last time it was retrograde in Aries was in 88. So even though Mars retrogrades every 2 years, it's usually retrograde in Leo, Virgo, Cancer, the summer signs. It's rarely retrograde in Aquarius, which we had 2 years ago, and rarely in Aries. So it's very powerful, and there's something very unique about the US election is that Bernie Sanders is born with Mars retrograde in Aries.
Fascinating.
So he will have a Mars retrograde return, and it's a rare occurrence. So I don't know, I hope that he's going to be healthy, first of all.
Yes.
Because that is tremendous stress, but it's also the drive. He's a fighter, he's an activist, and that's how he uses that Mars retrograde to make a difference in his own way. And it's interesting that Mars in Aries is the type of transit where you say, I quit. You know, I'm done with this job. I'm not, you know, responding to this authority anymore. I want something different.
Yeah.
So it's the time where you take charge of your own life again,
Mm-hmm.
and you want to go solo. So it's a time of redefinition, and if it squares all this Capricorn,
Mm-hmm.
you will want to do things your own way, and you will want to challenge authority. And it depends what system you're in. If you're in the corporate, rigid world, you're going to have to break some plates.
Right.
But if you are your own leader, if you are, you know, self-employed, that can actually take you, you know, forward, because you're going to use that Mars anyway that way. The interesting thing also about Mars retrograde, think about people born with it.
Mm-hmm.
They are usually extremely unique individuals. Like, they do things their own way,
Mm-hmm.
and for better and worse.
Right.
But, you know, I'm thinking of film director David Lynch.
Mm-hmm.
I'm thinking about Jack Nicholson.
Mm-hmm.
I'm thinking about Julian Assange, who was born right on the station. I'm thinking about Kurt Cobain, also on the station. And so these are people who did things really very differently. So Mars retrograde is not necessarily that, you know, feeling that you can't move forward, everything's blocked. It's just that you have to forge your own way through, you know, the path less traveled.
Mm-hmm.
And then if you manage to do that, you are actually changing people's views, changing people's mind. And that's what Bernie has been doing. You know, he brings a completely different
Right.
approach to politics.
Right.
And, you know, it doesn't matter if you like him or not. You can agree that it's nothing like we've seen before.
Right.
So the challenging thing about Mars retrograde is that it also, because of the, you know, the need to kind of take charge of your own destiny, it can lead to political battles. And sometimes war begin during Mars retrograde or right after it goes direct, because there's a lot of energy held back during the retrograde and it's released when it goes forward, and it creates that, you know, that kind of release that can be aggressive. So we'll see. My feeling is that because it's election time and we know, you know, the political climate is volatile,
Yes.
both, you know, the Republicans and the Democrats are going to give, you know, a very intense fight, but you can also anticipate internal battles, not just between them, but the, you know, the inner circles fighting. But because Mars is, you know, is in Aries, going direct right after the elections, and because there's a new cycle of Jupiter, Saturn, in Aquarius in December on the solstice, it seems like the wind is shifting. Like there is a change of flavor. Like the Jupiter Saturn brings usually a shift of leadership. Think about the mythology of Jupiter Saturn. I mean, Jupiter was, you know, basically dethroned his father.
Right.
And it can lead to, not just politically, but it can lead in our own lives to once again a new slate, starting anew. So what a year.
Yeah.
like they're all packed up, you know.
Yes.
It's like it's not a moment of rest. It's not like, oh, you know, the first 3 months are intense, but then you can let go. It's
And
action.
coinciding with our own busy year, at least in America, with our election cycle, you know, the timing of some of these
Well, it
things.
seems like they, you know, they probably knew about this, and it chose. Now, this slide, you know, I
Yeah.
chose that date. Um, this is the whole period of the retrograde, September
Yes.
9 to November 13. But
Yeah.
that particular day is about October 14th,
Okay.
where Mars retrogrades is opposing the Sun in Libra,
Mm.
and then square Pluto Saturn.
Right.
So usually the retrograde cycle peaks when the planet opposes the Sun. And that's usually when the drama of the retrograde is activated. You start to feel it the week before it goes retrograde, like the slowing down and tension is building up. Then whatever happens kind of accumulate and gathers. And then when the planets opposes the Sun, there's an impact,
Right.
activation of some sort. And, you know, Saturn leadership, Sun leadership, opposing Mars, somebody's going to blow a fuse.
And if you use dignity, Mars is in its own house, Sun
Detriment.
detriment,
And Saturn is also
and Saturn in his own house. Yeah.
And then
Jupiter's
Jupiter.
detriment.
So it's going to be unusual. What I would recommend on a personal level again, choose your battles. Don't get overly excited by everything, because it's easy with that kind of climate to, you know, to try to conquer too many things, to try to save the world all at once, and to, you know, to see villains everywhere, talk about, you know, conspiracies and lack of trust.
Yeah.
You know, since Pluto and Saturn have been dancing, and it's already the whole year together, and they're on the nodes, the climate of distrust is just getting so toxic.
Yeah.
Nothing is reliable. You know, everyone is corrupt. Like, I was talking to a friend, and they were talking about some, you know, very rich guy giving a lot of money. And you'd think, great.
Sounds good. Yeah.
But then under a Pluto Saturn climate, you see, what is he hiding? Like, why is he doing that? There must be another reason. Like, they're not telling us the whole truth. So with that climate, we can, you know, there's a reason to be an activist and to expose corruption, but don't get paranoid.
Right.
Because you're going to basically turn against your own friends, turn against good people who are trying to do good work, and maybe they made a mistake. Just move on, you know, don't take everything so personally and intensely.
I think choose your battles is a wise refrain to keep in mind. Before we jump to the end of the year, I did want to ask you, so Mercury, little old Mercury, which is part of this whole configuration on January 12th, do you see that as another way into navigating this in terms of our own communication? I mean, do you think it gets overwhelmed, or do you think it's a way in for us to manage this?
It's, you know, there's always, to me, there's nothing that is inherently good or bad. Mercury can help with corruption. You know, I have connections and I'm the trickster, and, you know, we can deal and make our exchanges, you know, it can lead to a lot of secret, you know, communication behind the scenes. But like you say, it's a way of navigating. It's a way of basically as things are changing, be alert. Don't just be stunned.
Mhm.
Like, look around, pay attention, and navigate this.
Yeah.
But the interesting thing, the Pluto series, if
Mm.
you look back at the mythology, Ceres, Persephone, Demetra, and Hades, they are uh, the classic story of the Greek time, and when they come together, Ceres and Demetra, depending on Roman or Greek name, have to do with what grows above the surface,
Mhm.
which is the agricultural cycles. And then Pluto is what is under the surface with the roots. So there's a story of abduction where Pluto kidnaps Demetra's daughter, Persephone. And there's the whole cycle where she grieves and nothing grows.
Right.
And when Pluto Saturn come together, there's usually that cycle
Mhm.
where there can be, again, a misuse of justice, and there can be a sense of injustice and some kind of starvation.
Mhm.
But we need to understand, looking back at this myth, we need to understand that Pluto is under the surface, and because of that, no one sees it. It's far away in the solar system. It's demoted to dwarfism.
Right.
And there's a sense of frustration. Like, I do all the work so that you can grow your vegetables.
Uh-huh.
I'm, feeding your roots, and I'm like the bad guy. But if you actually if you honor Pluto and you give it the credit, then Pluto doesn't have to be so pissed off and destructive.
Yeah.
And I think that has to do with the righteousness of Ceres. Like,
Mhm.
I'm the Earth Mother, and I feed everybody, but we're helping you. We're the
Right.
bacteria actually fertilizing your ground.
Yeah. Really the
The dead bodies.
interconnectedness
Yeah.
of everything.
So yeah, I mean, the grand finale is that previous slide.
Oh, did I go
the
past it?
Jupiter. Yeah, this
There
one.
we go.
I like to tell people, just go back to the year 2000 when the last conjunction
Mhm.
occurred. Every 20 years we have a Jupiter
Yes.
Saturn. See what happened in your life, and you usually hear stories. Well, yeah, that's the year I divorced and moved to Hawaii, and that's the year I got my promotion, and that's the year I bought a house, and that's the year.
Mhm.
So 2020 is going to be that kind of, that's the year that
Mhm.
things happen.
Right.
And, we can spend another hour talking about the fact that it's moving to a new element,
Yes. Barely in Aquarius there.
Yeah, for 200 years, this conjunction occurred in earth signs.
Yeah.
And now it's starting an air cycle. So not just a 20-year meeting, but a series of air sign conjunctions. Looking forward. That's all I can say.
Yeah, maybe look to see where this is falling in your own chart to get an idea of the area. And looking back is always good.
So yeah, 0 Aquarius, the whole range is late cardinal degrees,
Mhm.
because even if you're not Capricorn or Aries, if
Mhm.
you have planets in Libra or in Cancer, they're going to be activated.
Right.
And then, so about 20 cardinal until 0 to 3 fixed. That's the range of really the most potent activations this year.
All right. Well, that was quite a tour of the year. Maurice, I appreciate you doing this. Thank you for supporting Kepler College, our scholarship fund. Maurice will be teaching in February. Check the January. Check the Kepler website for that. And thank you all for participating in this, and especially Maurice, thank you for your time this
And
morning.
Happy New Year.
Yeah, Happy New Year,
We
everyone.
can say happy, just
Yeah.
be happy.
That's right. That's
Celebrate.
right. Absolutely. All right. Thank you very
for
much.
your time.